You see, on the one hand, a lot of people believe that it's biological, that people are just born gay. But you know what? The research does not show that at all. In fact, gay researchers themselves hypothesize that there are many factors that contribute to homosexuality. Now, on the other hand, there are a lot of people that just believe it's a choice, that people choose to be gay. Now, let me say, we do choose our behaviors, but we do not choose our attractions or our desires. So when we say people choose to feel that way, that's completely inaccurate. Because you see, desires and attractions are like feelings. They come from deep within us. They're not a conscious choice on our part. So where then does it come from? If you're not born that way, and if you don't choose to feel that way, where does it come from? Well, I believe that it is a developmental issue. And so I do want to say there are a number of factors that go into human development, and human development is very complex. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but I do want to give you an overview of what would lead to a person to having same-sex attractions. One of the factors is something called gender identity. Now, gender identity is the way a person sees himself in terms of his own gender. So that would be how masculine a boy views himself to be, or how feminine a girl views herself to be. So I want to explain to you how gender identity gets formed in a person's life. I want to explain first how it gets formed in a healthy way, and then I want to go back and explain what happens in the development of gender identity that would lead to same-sex attractions. And I'm going to explain from a male perspective because it's a little bit easier to understand. The female development is a little bit more complex. But I know. But I will go back and describe a few factors that do lead to lesbianism. So first, the male development. When babies are born, all babies, they see themselves as one unit with their mother. So all babies just think that they are one with their mother. Well, eventually, a baby is able to realize that he is not one with his mother, that he's a separate entity. Well, around the age of 1.5 or so, children are also beginning to differentiate the difference between genders. So little boys just starting to recognize girls are girls, boys are boys. I'm a boy, daddy's a boy, mommy's a girl. Well, around the age of 2.5, he now faces a challenge where he must be able to begin separating from his attachment that he has with his mother and attaching himself to his father. And so it is through the relationship that he begins to form with his father that he starts to develop a sense of gender identity. He starts to develop a sense of who he is as a male. And you see, he looks to his father to answer a number of questions for him. He needs a lot of questions answered. He wants to know, what are boys all about? How do they walk? How do they talk? How do they act? Who am I as a boy? Do I have what it takes? Do I measure up? Do you see value in me? And this is all happening at an unconscious level, certainly. It's going on between the ages of about 2.5 to 4, where he's making this break from the mother and he's attaching to the father and he's looking to the father to answer all of those questions. And so the father answers those questions by spending time with his son, by showing interest in his son, specifically showing interest in what his son is interested in. He also answers those questions by verbally affirming his son. I'm so proud of you. You're such a fine young man. You're so brave and strong. You're so special. And he conveys that information through physical touch, both affectionate touch, like hugging and holding, as well as playful touch, like playing rough together, wrestling. It's actually through physical touch and playing together that a boy develops a sense of his own masculine body. So, as he goes on, at around the age of 5 or 6, he now reaches another stage where this is usually a time when kids are starting school. And so around this age, he now looks to male peers to answer the same questions for him that he needed answered from his dad. What are boys all about? How do they walk? How do they talk? How do they act? Who am I as a boy? Do I measure up? Do I have what it takes? Will you accept me? Do I fit in? And so he looks to the other boys to discover who he is in relation to them. And now what he needs from them is he needs to be accepted and included and affirmed, and he needs to spend several years bonding with members of the same sex. You know, if you've ever noticed, when kids are in elementary school, they really don't want much to do with the opposite sex, do they? You know, girls have cooties. Well, that is a God-given stage of development, because we cannot become interested in the opposite sex until we first understand our own gender. We have to know who we are and what we're all about before we can be interested in the opposite sex. And so boys have then that steady diet of male connecting or male bonding from the time around 2.5 or so all the way up through puberty. And those 10 or so years give that child a strong sense of who he is as a male, so that when he reaches puberty, he now can begin to become interested in the opposite sex. Now he's got a good sense of who he is, so he then begins to become interested in girls. What are girls all about? They're the intriguing, mysterious other gender. So for the boy that develops same-sex attractions or homosexual attractions, this process that I've just described does not happen. So let me go back and explain what happens in that process of development. But again, I will say human development is very complex, so there are a number of factors that contribute, and I'm just going to give you a basic overview. Usually, for the boy who will develop same-sex attractions, around the age of 2.5 or so, there's something that prevents him from detaching from his mother and attaching himself to his father. Either he doesn't have a father. Now let me say this, I certainly don't in any way want to imply that all boys who grow up without fathers are going to be gay. Clearly we know that is not the case. There are a number of factors that contribute. This is one of them. And if a boy doesn't have a father figure can step in. But for the boy who ends up with same-sex attractions, either he doesn't have a father that he can connect with, or he doesn't have a father that he perceives as safe and welcoming. Now let me say a word about perceptions. Perceptions are everything. It's not so much what happens to us that matters as how we perceive what happens to us. So if a boy does not perceive that his father wants that relationship and is safe and welcoming, then he's going to have difficulty connecting with him. You know, the perceptions are influenced by our temperament. So let me just say a few words about that. Well, an example of how temperament influences perceptions is that a child who's more sensitive is going to take things more personally than a child who's not as sensitive by nature. And so temperament affects how we see things that are happening to us. Usually the temperament of a child who will go on to have same-sex attractions is that he's sensitive, so he's taking things to heart that happen to him. He might be taking things personally, even if they're not meant personally. He also, usually the child that ends up with same-sex attractions is usually very smart and very intuitive. He's paying attention to every little detail, and he notices everything that happens. And he tends to take those things to heart. And so he also, another factor is, temperamental factor, is sometimes they're more artistic than athletic. And so those are just some of the temperamental factors that go into it. But because of perceptions, he may perceive that his father does not want a relationship with him. Let me say another word about that. I have known fathers that loved their children very much, but somehow just didn't convey it to their children in a way that they could receive and understand. I've known of fathers who were loved their kids, but were really loud and maybe a little bit explosive when they became angry. And to a young 2-year-old boy, a yelling man can look like a monster. And what 2-year-old boy is going to leave the connection with the mother and attach himself to one that he perceives to be like a monster? It's not very likely. I've also known of fathers who really meant well, but thought that the way to help their sons be more of a man would be to tell them how they didn't measure up. Like, in other words, saying things like, quit acting like a sissy. You're acting like such a baby. You're such a little girl. What a mama's boy. Things like that, although maybe well-intended, to a little child, what a child hears is, I don't measure up. I don't have what it takes. And at that time when their sense of gender identity is forming, great damage can be done. And so for any of these reasons, usually around the age of 2.5 or so, the child has difficulty detaching from the mother and attaching to the father. But he wants to attach to the Father because God has put it in the heart of every child, that desire for connection, especially with their parents and with the same-sex parent as well. And so that child is craving for that, and he might try to attach to his father, but if he senses rejection, he will try a few times, but he will eventually give up trying because we can only handle so much rejection. And what happens is he will detach from the Father. If he has sensed rejection, he will detach from the Father internally and what the Father represents. They call this defensive detachment. So it's basically like he says, fine, if you don't want me, then I don't want you. And he rejects the Father as well as all that the Father represents, which is masculinity. Now, deep down inside, he's still craving that. He's still craving for that acceptance and love of his Father, but he just can't take the rejection, and so he detaches. So instead of soaking in masculinity at this very important stage, he continues to stay connected with his mother, and he soaks in femininity. And usually, for the boy that ends up with same-sex attractions, there are also other females giving input into his life. Usually there's at least a sister or more, a few sisters, an aunt, a grandmother, other females in his life. And so what happens is he soaks in all this femininity, and he learns all about girls and what girls are all about. But he's craving to learn about boys. He's craving to learn about who he is as a boy. He wants to know about that, but he's not getting that. And so he goes on soaking in femininity, craving masculinity. Well, by the time he is ready to start school, he will often, not always, but typically have a difficult time connecting with other boys because either he'll feel intimidated by other boys or he'll just feel more comfortable with girls because that's who he's always been with. Or if he's developed any feminine mannerisms, he might be rejected by the other boys. So he goes to school and he's craving acceptance from them and he wants relationship with them, but he will typically end up sticking with the girls and having lots of girls for friends and not connecting with the boys, and so those needs for same-sex connection go unmet. So he goes on through elementary school watching the boys from afar, wishing he could be with them, wishing that they would notice him and accept him and love him, but all the while just getting a stronger sense of femininity and what females are all about. So by the time this child reaches puberty, he certainly isn't going to be interested in the opposite sex. He already knows all about the opposite sex. He's kind of been hanging out with the girls most of his life. What he is curious about and intrigued by are boys. That's what he's still wanting to know, and that's what he's still needing. Let me say this. When God-given needs go unmet, those needs do not go away. Those needs will usually either intensify or take on another form. And so for a boy whose need for same-sex connection has not been met, by the time he reaches puberty, that need has not gone away. That need has intensified, it has grown, it's like a hunger inside of him that is just deepening. And so this is what happens. At puberty, the body is starting to change and he's beginning to develop sexual feelings, and it's almost like the wires get crossed. It's almost like that hunger for male love that God gave him now becomes a sexualized hunger for male love. Now, to him, what it feels like is that he's sexually attracted to these other boys, that he needs a romantic relationship with them. Well, that's not what he needs. What he needs is healthy, non-sexual, emotionally deep relationships with other boys and with his father. But to him, it feels like a sexual need. It feels like a craving for a romantic relationship.